Have you ever noticed that when people talk about women today, it's either praise without question or criticism without compassion? It's rare to find a voice that actually cuts through the noise and tells the truth. Society paints women as pure, nurturing, morally elevated beings. The ideal woman is soft, selfless, beautiful, the emotional backbone of civilization. But what if this image isn't truth, but a mask? A carefully constructed illusion? Over 100 years ago, one philosopher dared to strip that mask away. Friedrich Nietzsche wasn't afraid to say what others wouldn't. He didn't worship women, nor did he resent them. He looked deeper. While most thinkers of his time were caught up in either dismissing women as inferior or placing them on a pedestal, Nietzsche asked a different question. Not what are women supposed to be, but what are they really? Beneath the roles, beneath the expectations, beneath the stories men told themselves about love, loyalty, and virtue, what he found was raw, uncomfortable, and in many ways, timeless. He believed that the relationship between men and women wasn't based on equality or idealized love, but on instinct, on power, on survival. And when you really stop to look around today, behind the hashtags, the empowerment campaigns, the backlash and culture wars, Nietzsche's vision feels hauntingly familiar. This script isn't about blaming anyone. It's not about glorifying men or criticizing women. It's about seeing something deeper. The forces that shape attraction, gender, and identity beneath the surface. So if you're tired of pretty lies, and you're ready to stare into something more real, more unsettling, and maybe more freeing, stay with me. Because once you understand how Nietzsche saw women, you may never look at love, power, or yourself the same way again. Nietzsche believed that men don't fall in love with women. They fall in love with the illusion of women. That illusion, it's not just beauty or charm. It's something much deeper, a fantasy of purity, sweetness, emotional safety, and moral superiority. In Nietzsche's eyes, this wasn't real love. It was a carefully constructed projection, built by men, for men, to serve their own emotional needs. And it wasn't admiration. It was denial. See, Nietzsche thought most men were too afraid to confront the full reality of a woman's nature, her instincts, her desires, her independence. So instead, they replaced her with a symbol, a myth, a goddess in their minds who exists to inspire, soothe, and justify their own worth. This, Nietzsche argued, was one of society's most profound lies. Because when you strip away the flowers, the poetry, the adoration, what you find isn't disrespect. It's fear. Men idealize women because they're afraid of what lies beneath. They fear emotional independence. They fear sexual autonomy. They fear the idea of a woman who doesn't need to be saved, who doesn't exist to complete them or validate them. In Nietzsche's mind, this wasn't just personal. It was cultural. He saw a world where love itself was built on illusion. And when the illusion cracks, when a real woman with real agency steps into view, men often feel betrayed. But the betrayal doesn't come from her. It comes from their own fantasy collapsing under the weight of reality. This fantasy, he said, isn't romantic. It's cowardly. It reduces women to safe, controllable symbols, and in doing so, it robs both men and women of real connection. But here's where Nietzsche flipped the script. He didn't see women as weak or morally lacking. In fact, he believed they had their own kind of strength, different from men, but no less powerful. Strategic, intuitive, rooted in survival and instinct. To Nietzsche, the truth was this: women weren't mysterious because they were hard to understand. They were mysterious because men refused to look. And when you finally do, when you strip away the illusion and face the real woman in front of you, that's when the real relationship and the real power begins. When Nietzsche looked at women, he didn't see weakness. He saw a different kind of power. A power that didn't shout, didn't demand, and didn't dominate in obvious ways, but one that whispered, guided, and often won without anyone realizing it was a competition. In a world where women were denied formal authority, no thrones, no armies, no votes, Nietzsche believed they adapted. They learned to survive and succeed in a system built against them. And they did it not through brute force, but through what he called psychological strategy. This wasn't manipulation, it was intelligence, refined over generations. Women, Nietzsche thought, developed an instinct for subtle influence. They shaped the decisions of powerful men without issuing commands. They protected themselves without begging for protection. They read the room, read emotions, and read intentions, sometimes faster than the men around them even knew what they were feeling. Where men raised empires with swords and speeches, Nietzsche believed women shaped the men who built those empires. To him, their power was relational, not because they were weak, but because they were realists. They knew that survival in a male-dominated world required precision, charm, timing, presence. They became masters of what moved men: desire, pride, ego. Nietzsche saw this and didn't condemn it. He admired it. He warned people not to underestimate it. Because this form of power, soft on the outside, razor-sharp underneath, is hard to detect and even harder to resist. And he believed it worked so well because it was built not on force, but on understanding. Women, he said, didn't need to fight for dominance. They learned how to influence it, not with aggression, but with subtle cues, not with loud demands, but with presence that shifted dynamics in silence. They weren't passive, they were tactical. He even suggested that women had a deeper understanding of human nature than most men. Not because they were born with more empathy, but because centuries of exclusion forced them to become observers, analyzers, survivors. In Nietzsche's view, this was a form of evolutionary brilliance, a way of holding power when all traditional paths to it were blocked. And the most dangerous thing? It's invisible. Most people don't even know it's happening, but Nietzsche did. And that's why he didn't see women as fragile flowers. He saw them as quiet tacticians, not less powerful than men, just different, and often more effective. Nietzsche didn't believe in morality as something pure, universal, or sacred. To him, morality was never neutral. It was always a tool. And when it came to women, he saw that tool being used with extraordinary precision. He argued that throughout history, women weren't moral because they were better people. They were moral because they had to be, because morality offered them a form of control in a world where physical strength and political power belonged to men. In Nietzsche's view, women elevated values like patience, humility, and self-sacrifice, not because they were weak, but because those traits gave them leverage. They built entire moral frameworks that made their survival strategies look like virtues. And society, eager to believe in the nobility of these values, accepted it without question. This wasn't deception. Nietzsche called it adaptation. He believed women had perfected the art of moral camouflage, turning limitation into identity, dependency into virtue. Where men used swords and laws to dominate, women used stories, values, and emotion. And it worked. Because if society believes that humility is holy, then the person forced into submission suddenly looks saint-like, not marginalized. If patience is praised, then waiting becomes wisdom, not desperation. Nietzsche saw this strategy and didn't judge it. He respected it, but he also refused to romanticize it. He didn't think women followed morality because it was right. He thought they used it because it worked. In a hostile world, it gave them a voice without raising it. It gave them safety without confrontation. It gave them influence, quietly, consistently, invisibly. And that's what disturbed him, not the morality itself, but the illusion that it was innocent. To Nietzsche, every moral posture was a form of performance, not just among women, but especially effective in women because of how society treated them. He believed they had turned moral language into a subtle kind of weapon. one that disarmed opponents without ever revealing the blade. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was strategic, emotional, and almost impossible to resist. In Nietzsche's world, morality wasn't about truth. It was about survival. And women, he believed, had turned it into an art. To Nietzsche, love wasn't a sweet merging of souls. It wasn't peace or safety or destiny. It was a war. Not a loud, chaotic war, but a quiet, psychological one. A battle of instincts beneath the surface of romance. Where others saw unity, he saw conflict. Where others spoke of harmony, he saw strategy. He believed that men and women are not naturally aligned. They desire each other, yes, but for very different, often opposing reasons. And those reasons are rarely conscious. Men, he thought, love through projection. They attach their hopes, fantasies, and ideals onto women, expecting emotional security, beauty, and redemption in return. They see her not as she is, but as they need her to be. Women, on the other hand, love through instinct. Nietzsche believed their love was sharper, rooted in survival, not fairy tales. Not because they're cold or calculating, but because history never gave them the luxury of idealism. For centuries, women had to find strength, safety, and status through the men they partnered with. Love, in that context, became less about passion and more about preservation. A woman didn't just want a partner. She needed an ally in a world built against her. And Nietzsche found this deeply honest. He didn't blame women for that instinct. He blamed the stories we tell, the myths that paint love as pure, equal, and innocent. Because beneath the flowers, the poetry, and the vows, Nietzsche saw a negotiation of power. Two forces, male and female, using each other, needing each other, shaping each other, and often doing it without ever saying it out loud. He believed that society dressed this war up in soft language and pretty rituals. But behind it all, love was struggle. Attraction was instinct. And relationships were never just about connection. They were about control. That doesn't mean love isn't real, but for Nietzsche, love is real because it's raw. Because it's driven by biology, emotion, need, and fear. He didn't think that made it ugly. He thought it made it true. Nietzsche lived in the 19th century, a time when women were expected to be passive, obedient, and confined to the home. But even then, he saw the storm coming. He saw the signs of change, women starting to question, to push back, to step outside the roles history had written for them. And he wasn't surprised. He was unsettled, because Nietzsche believed that the strength of women had never been fully understood, not because it wasn't real, but because it was veiled, hidden behind social expectations and romantic ideals. For centuries, women had wielded indirect power, soft, strategic, emotional. It was influence dressed in kindness, control disguised as charm. But what happens when that power stops hiding? What happens when women no longer need men for survival, not for protection, not for income, not even for identity? Nietzsche predicted that the rise of the independent woman wouldn't bring balance. It would bring disruption, not because women weren't ready for freedom, but because men weren't ready for women who were free. He believed that most men, raised to feel inherently superior, would be deeply threatened by a woman who didn't need their validation. And that threat wouldn't show up as respect. It would show up as resentment. To Nietzsche, this wasn't misogyny. It was prediction. A woman who no longer depends on men for safety or status becomes something entirely new, unapologetic, assertive, and self-defined. And that kind of woman, Nietzsche believed, would terrify a world built on comforting illusions about gender roles. He didn't say this as praise or as warning. He said it as a truth, a shift that would force both men and women to confront who they really are without the stories they've been telling themselves for generations. The independent woman wasn't the end of femininity. She was its evolution, and her rise would shake the very foundation of male identity. Not softly, not politely, but permanently. For Nietzsche, most relationships weren't rooted in love. They were built on mutual illusion. Men idealized, women adapted. Both wore masks. He believed men wanted to see women as symbols of beauty, purity, and emotional salvation, not because that's who women are, but because that's who men needed them to be. At the same time, women learned how to play into that illusion, not out of malice, but out of survival. The result? A game, a dance, two people projecting fantasies onto each other, calling it love, and wondering why it never feels real. But Nietzsche didn't stop there. As brutal as his analysis could be, he also pointed toward something more hopeful, a rare possibility. He imagined what could happen if both sides dropped the act. What if a man stopped idealizing and a woman stopped performing? What if neither tried to dominate, to charm, to control? What if both stood before each other not as saviors or enemies, but as equals, equally flawed, equally strong, equally real? This kind of relationship, Nietzsche admitted, would be rare. Most people cling to comfort. They'd rather live in the illusion than face what's underneath. But for those willing to go further, to abandon projection, expectation, and the need to win, something deeper could emerge. Not peace exactly, but clarity, honesty, power shared, not seized. A relationship not built on fairy tales but on truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable. Nietzsche called it mutual becoming. Not a reconciliation of the sexes, but a transformation. Two forces facing each other without masks, without fear, and saying, "I see you, all of you, and I'm still here." Nietzsche didn't write about women to insult them. He wrote to challenge the illusions that keep us blind, the fantasy of perfect love, of harmless power, of moral innocence. He believed that only when we strip away the comfort can we see clearly. And in that clarity, there's something powerful. Not resentment, but recognition. Men and women aren't enemies. They're mirrors. Not the same, but equally shaped by instinct, fear, and the will to survive. To Nietzsche, truth was sacred, even when it hurt. And if we dare to look, really look, we might find something stronger than illusion. Understanding.